I accidentally shared the playlist, but we will send out the playlist so that y'all can dance and move. So we're going to do a quick movement exercise again, just to get us back into the groove, back into our bodies. So I'm a writer and I'm working on a book, but I also love journaling. And at the end of the day, sometimes I would just not want to journal because my hands were tired and I didn't want to write any more words on a piece of paper. So I invented something called body journaling, and I'm going to invite you all to body journal with me. You can either stay seated or you can stand up. And I invite you to stand up if you feel like you're able to and you want to stand up for this exercise. So we're all going to stand up. And what you're going to do with body journaling is close your eyes, listen to the music, and think about what you've heard and what you've experienced so far in this virtual summit. And start to go through some of the quotes or some of the moments or some of the people you might have started to meet and some of the things that you're carrying with you. And I'm going to put up the music right now. I invite you to close your eyes, get into your body, and think through some of the moments that you went through today in the virtual summit. Let the body fill you. I really encourage you, even if you're not a dancer, use your hands, use your body, try to feel the movement. You all, yes. Thanks, yeah. That's a more chilled out version than the first dance, but sometimes you have to mix it up. Really appreciate you all body journaling with me. I'm gonna pass it over to our wonderful moderator for this next session, Eve Pearlman, who's just a wonderful human, a friend, and is a seasoned journalist and runs Spaceship Media, which is this incredible organization that's using the power of journalism, the power of stories to build communities and to reduce polarization. And she'll introduce our next panel and our panelists. So take it away, Eve.
Thank you, Scott. It's so nice to see you. And thank you for introducing me to the concept of body journaling. I like it quite a bit. It's nice to see. I think we have 12 pages of participants here. I don't know what that adds up to, but it's nice to be together with you all. Welcome to this afternoon session, Bridging Red-Blue Divides. My name, Scott said, is Eve Pearlman. I'm the founder of Spaceship Media, and I run the organization still. We're a journalism organization. We launched in 2016 with a mission to work on the really difficult and interlinked problems of polarization and trust in journalism, specifically the decline in trust in journalism. We are super lucky to have two great thinkers and actors here today, Robb Willer, who's a professor at Stanford, and Stephen Olikara, who's the founder of the Millennial Action Network. We'll get to hear from them about their work and their thinking specifically around bridging red-blue divides. And then we'll have some time in the second half for questions from you. So as they come to mind, you can throw them up in the chat. And we look forward to to hearing from you. So chat them in whenever they come to mind. Just a little bit more about me. I come to bridging work as a journalist. I've been a journalist, local journalist, happily my whole life. I actually work just across from the Greater Good Science Center in Alameda, California. But I really came explicitly to bridging after the 2016 election when I started to think much more intentionally about how some of the standards of journalistic practice work to undermine coming together, specifically how we frame stories a lot of times, point, counterpoint, how we chase shiny objects. We look for the extremes rather than middle ground. And so I really started thinking about how I could do this work that I think is so valuable to our society. The fourth estate, we hold facts, we hold truth, we hold community. How we could do this work differently. And so we created a methodology within Spaceship, what we call dialogue journalism, and it really reconceptualizes journalistic practice. And we put communities, specifically divided communities, people that are polarized around, there's so many issues that we polarize around, together at the center. We support them in conversation, and we support them with reporting, telling stories about that work and for people specifically. We've been incredibly fortunate and lucky to work with major journalism organizations around this country: Vox, Digital First Media, Time, Univision, on conversations about the issues that most divide us, like guns, race, electoral politics. And what I've learned over and over again, and what I take profound heart from every time we run a conversation and a project, is how people can and will, when given structure and support, talk with kindness and intention and meaning. That, we can do this, we want to do this, we feel better when we do this, and not just ordinary citizens, but journalists. So when we engage with our communities with a different kind of heart and a different kind of orientation, things look and feel really better. The other thing that I think about a lot, and then is sort of a compelling ongoing takeaway and challenge, is how journalists can rethink how they work, so that our facts, our information, can be received and trusted. And we think a lot about how relationships, something that I assume everyone on this call wanders in and works through, how important relationships are to trust and to belief. So that's just a little bit of what I do and how I work. And I've been marvelously lucky to travel and meet so many people who do such great work. Today, we're going to hear from Robb and Stephen. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions and then again hear from you. So Robb, he runs the Polarization and Social Change Lab at Stanford. He studies politics, morality, status, cooperation, and masculinity. He's written in major publications like New York Times, Washington Post, Vox. He's done interesting research in a whole lot of fields. What he's going to talk to you about in a minute is moral reframing, how to talk across partisan divides. And he'll explore that in a second. I had to say, I appreciated this little tidbit, Robb, from your bio, and I found it on Wikipedia, so you can tell me if it's wrong, but it's, I guess your master's thesis was about how people, when they are presented with unintelligible texts, they ascribe more meaning to them if the author is, I think it's well-known or more positively known. So I found that interesting, and interesting to sort of a little not totally related fact, but interesting as we think about this work. We're also lucky to have with us Stephen Olikara. He's the founder and president of the Millennial Action Project. It's the largest nonprofit organization for young lawmakers in this country. They work with policymakers in Congress and in legislators around the country to transcend partisan divides and strengthen our democracy. And so we will hear a little bit about his work. And I'm really just delighted to have a little time with all of you today. So Robb, I wanted to just start out with research, and specifically
Sure.
the research you've done around moral reframing, what it involves, how it works, and how it can have an impact on depolarization, and really most specifically how we can use it to promote understanding across divides.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first want to say thanks for that really kind introduction, Eve, and thanks to everybody at the Greater Good Science Center for organizing this awesome conference. It's such a pleasure to be here. I should say, before I was at Stanford, I was at Berkeley for 6 or 7 years, and I've been affiliated with the Greater Good Science Center, for a proud affiliate of the Greater Good Science Center, for more than a decade now. So this is a great honor. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about this technique that we've worked on called moral reframing. So in my lab at Stanford, the Polarization and Social Change Lab, we think of the polarization problem as having two major axes, which are related, but you could separate them usefully. So one is attitudinal polarization, so differences of opinion on issues, candidates, ideological divides, and then affective polarization, which is more or less partisan animosity negative emotions that flow across political divides. You can see that these two things are clearly related, but it's also useful to separate them, and they're both big problems. Attitudinal polarization is a problem if you're trying to create political consensus to do something in the country with policy, or get people elected, or just pass policies that can work on social problems. Affective polarization is a problem if you're concerned about this this hurtful division that's at the center of our country now. We've studied a technique that we call moral reframing. Here, I'm going to share my slides really quick here, which is, in a nutshell, can you all see this? Just want to confirm. Great. Okay. Which is, in a nutshell, the idea that you can reframe a political position to be consistent with your audience's moral values, and you might be more persuasive than if you simply articulated a political position as consistent with your own moral values. And the reason that this technique could be effective for persuasion is because our political divide in America rests on top of a deeper moral divide. And research suggests that when political divisions rest on top of deeper moral divisions, that moral convictions are particularly hard, or sorry, that political divides are particularly hard to address. So if we have this notion that below the sort of superficial, differences of opinion, important differences of opinion, but differences of opinion that rest on deeper divides, that there is this deeper division. This may seem like just entirely bad news. Oh no, it's not just a political divide, it's also a values divide. But it also, I think, is the beginning of an avenue to political persuasion, like the beginning of a solution to our problem. So I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. And somehow I seem to have drawn on my slides. I didn't realize what I was doing when I did that. So ignore the squiggly line. So if we're going to try to leverage our insight on the moral divisions in America to try to create a tool to create political consensus and overcome attitudinal divides in America, we're going to need some kind of a typology, some kind of a map of what people's moral values are. And we found that moral foundations theory, this theory associated with John Haidt and Jesse Graham, can be very helpful in this capacity. So these researchers essentially argue that we can think of Americans' moral values as falling into sort of 5 boxes. So people think about fairness and equality to some extent or another. People think about how much policies or actions and hurt people or show care for people. People think about in-group loyalty and patriotism. People think about authority, showing respect for authority, and people think about purity and sanctity. And right away, you might notice that these values correspond to different political ideologies, that different Americans care about these values to different extents. And that's exactly what the research finds. So liberals care more than conservatives do about fairness and equality and harm and care, or they reason more in terms of these values. Conservatives care more about these other 3 moral values: in-group loyalty, authority and respect, purity and sanctity. And our reasoning with moral reframing is, okay, the default is for us to talk about our issues in terms of our own moral values. What if we thought creatively about why someone with different values might agree with us on an issue or a candidate while still having the values they do? Because if you're trying to get somebody to move on a political position as well as underlying values, that's a very difficult sell, because people are willing to fight and die for their moral values, right? And so maybe meeting them where they are could be a way to be more persuasive. So we've been testing this in experiments for like a decade, and then there's been going back to when we were at Berkeley, and then there's been other labs that have also tested this. I just want to show you one test that we did where we saw, where we were interested in seeing would an argument for environmental protection that was made in terms of more liberal values or more conservative values, which one would be more effective. So what we did was we did an experiment where we showed a bunch of liberal and conservative Americans either this message, a kind of classically liberal values-based message for environmental protection. This is an excerpt from it, but it said things like the dumping of waste and chemicals into our lakes and seas has resulted in the deaths of billions of fish and other sea life. The result is barren soil across the world, making it harder to produce food, resulting in famine and starvation. And we compared this message's effectiveness to this very different message. You maybe haven't heard a message like this. And it's built on the moral value of purity and sanctity. So it said things like, it is important that we protect our natural habitats from desecration and pollution. Keeping our forests, drinking waters, and skies pure is of vital importance. Chemical particles end up everywhere in our food, on our skin, and inside our lungs. Dirty, polluted air actually enters our bodies and becomes a part of us. And it showed this picture, this insane picture of someone drinking a dirty glass of water. I wouldn't advise doing that if you can avoid it. And this smog-filled sky in an urban center and so on. And so it was really designed to say pollution violates the value of purity. And here's what we found is that when conservatives saw the purity message, they were significantly more supportive of environmental protection than if they saw that harm message I just showed you, or a control message, which was just a neutral message. We even found that it eliminated the liberal conservative difference in support for environmental protection, which is quite noteworthy, pretty hard to do. So we also measured concern about global warming, maybe the most important environmental issue, probably the most important environmental issue. And we found that, again, conservatives that were shown this purity message about the environment showed more concern about global warming, although it wasn't sufficient to eliminate the partisan difference on global warming, which would be pretty stunning if it had. But it's worth noting this message didn't even mention global warming. That's just like a related political issue. So in just the time I have left here, I want to highlight, this technique for building consensus around political issues by meeting people where they are in terms of their moral makeup. It does pretty well. It's pretty robust. It's been replicated in a lot of studies, and this is noteworthy because it's the political persuasion literature is really like a graveyard of failed interventions, and so this is I think an unusual technique for being useful for creating political consensus. But the big pushback we often get is that this seems incredibly intuitive. Like you meet somebody where they are. How hard is that to figure out? And indeed, I found this quote from Blaise Pascal from 500 years ago. He said, "It is necessary to have regard to the person whom we wish to persuade, what principles he acknowledges, and then observe in the thing in question what affinity it has with the acknowledged principles." So he's just explaining, more eloquently our idea 500 years ago. And, you can find people even before this that have had more or less this idea. And this is the curse of being a social scientist. It's a good job, but just when you think you have a new idea, it turns out some French guy with terrific hair had that idea like a half a millennia ago, right? So, but I just want to highlight, I want to note this before I kind of wrap up this answer is just that when we actually ask people to make persuasive appeals on issues that matter to them, they overwhelmingly use their own values. They don't use the values of the people they speak to. Why? Because that's the default, right? Like my values are true and they're the right reason to hold this position. And I struggle to see any other reason why you would hold this position. So I think that this shows that an important dimension of political polarization that we have to overcome if we're going to try to build consensus and overcome divides is the deeper moral divisions. We have to see them and operate in light of them.
Thank you, Rob, for that concise and pretty explanation of a really, I think, useful and thought-provoking concept. I wanted to turn now to Stephen. I wanted to ask you just to talk at first about the Millennial Action Project. Tell us, what you do, how you work, and I'm also curious just about what drove you, a little bit about what drove you to do this work early in your career and with such, I think, success and zest. But I also wanted to ask you as a second part of this question, I know you're a jazz musician, and I wanted to hear a little bit if you draw from that experience, that work, as you engage across difference. So I'm going to kick it to you to answer that question.
Thank you, Eve. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for that introduction. And I also want to thank Jason for the invitation to be here today. Really a pleasure to be with all of you. And Eve, you're right. Music played a big role in the founding of Millennial Action Project. And so to give a quick overview of what we do and the philosophies and ideas that led to our model. And Robb's presentation on moral reframing couldn't have been a better framework to tee up this conversation. So thank you for that, Robb. So the Millennial Action Project is a nonpartisan organization that activates young leaders at the beginning of their public service to bridge divides and strengthen our democracy. It's premised on the idea that, as James Madison said in the Federalist Papers, that our country should be a diverse democracy and that we benefit when we have a multiplicity of ideas coming together to advance the public interest. So we see our political bridge building work as inextricably linked to the advancement of democracy. And we formed this organization based on two long-term trends we thought would fundamentally shape politics in the coming 20 to 30 years. One is the worsening polarization, which studies have shown is along partisan lines the worst it's been since the Civil War. And the second major trend is the rise of the millennial and Generation Z cohorts, which are approaching politics in a radically different way, not being boxed into some of the old partisan fault lines that we've had before. And so the question became, how is this next generation going to govern our country? And so we work with these young leaders through a network of what we call future caucuses, which is based in Congress as well as about 30 state legislatures across the country. They're bipartisan state legislators, roughly under the age of 45, who commit to doing three things. One is building relationships across our lines of division. The second is developing policy ideas that are not left versus right, but rather future versus the past. And that's what I think ties most closely to what Robb was saying earlier in terms of reframing issues. And then the third thing we do is try and scale up a narrative around political bridge building that's not about a dilution of ideas, but rather about bringing the best ideas together to evolve us together to a new place. And to touch on that concept of political evolution, I really have to go to my personal background that you referenced, Eve, as a musician. I grew up, I see in the chat someone's asking which organization, called Millennial Action Project. Oh, thank you, Scott. So I grew up in the greater Milwaukee area. If there are any Wisconsinites out there, go Badgers. And my parents immigrated to this country from India. And so we grew up in a community that's unfortunately, we have a great culture in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee, but we're also the most racially and politically segregated metro area in the United States. And so we, as brown immigrants, had to figure out where we fit in that racial divide. And what really excited me about getting involved in community work and civic engagement was a chance to bridge those divides, but it came through music. You know, my parents would have definitely preferred for me to become an engineer, but I was telling them I want to be the lead guitarist of a rock band. And I met a group of friends musically that had a lot of different types of musical genres that they played. You referenced jazz, which I'll get to in a second, but we also played in rock bands. We had a James Brown cover band. We had a Jewish klezmer band. If anyone is familiar with Yiddish music, we played a lot of that. And I had a funk band, a hip hop band that covered a lot of music by the Roots. I had a folk band that sounded like Bon Iver, an experimental rock band that sounded like Radiohead, a Green Day-esque kind of band, punk rock, and there was jazz. And the thing that I liked about playing these styles of music is music became a rare force to transcend those divisions in the greater Milwaukee area. And the thing I learned by playing music in this context is when you had the fusion of musical perspectives coming together, it wasn't like we were compromising our principles or our ideals. We welcomed it. We wanted that more. And that's what led to better art. And I use jazz as a metaphor here because I think that best captured the art of bridge building musically that I argue translates to politics. And there are three things I learned in particular through jazz music. One is the power of listening. And on your first day in jazz camp, maybe some of you have had this experience if you play jazz. My jazz instructor told me, put away your instrument. We're not playing any music today. We're going to sit down and listen. And I still remember him saying the number one skill in playing jazz music is listening. They tell you to have a big ear to really understand what people are trying to communicate. And only after you listen can you play. That's rule number one. The second thing is improvisation. Jazz is an improvised art form. And the thing I learned from that is truly how to think about reinventing existing paradigms. Jazz is all about the unexpected. And even when you listen to old jazz tunes today, they always sound new because no jazz piece performed has ever sounded the same. Think about that. The third thing is call and response. And I would argue jazz, like our democracy, is a call and response art form. You put out a call, you try and listen to other ideas out there, you refine your own ideas, and you're able to come up with something that's better. And I would argue today, and this is what I'll leave you with, is I think our political discourse today has become more of a call and shutdown type of culture. And we need to start opening that up. But we need a new vision of how we do it, because if it's the old kind of vision where you're compromising your ideals and principles, I don't think particularly the younger generation is going to get involved in that. I think we need to see political bridge building as a key avenue for making political change. And we've seen that through MAP on issues ranging from gerrymandering reform to clean energy, to even getting the CDC last year authorized and funded to study gun violence as a public health issue. Each of those things got done, real change, because we built these, what I call radical bridges of cooperation.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really, really beautiful to hear you talk about your work in the context of art, really, and as attending to others and participating with others so deeply. I am thinking about things like rooms, telling my teenagers, for example, to turn down their music, and like, how do we not, if we're not even in the same room playing together, or we're not even joined together by a key thing, which I think relates to what you talked about just there at the end, which it's a call and shut down, not a call and engage. So I enjoy your call to engage. I'm going to jump back to Robb for a second, and then back to you, and then you're seeing really interesting, thoughtful questions come through. So I wanted to ask you, Robb, just about COVID. I know it's on all of our minds, probably far more than we wish it were on all of our minds, and it's permeating our lives and our work in so many ways. But I wanted to know, and I know the research is young, we're not that far into it, but what you're seeing is effective around communication about COVID response, and really specifically about ways that what you're learning or seeing. And I know I don't want to put you on the spot because I don't know, we're 3 months into this, but what you're seeing might work to talk specifically about how to take shared responsibility. So social distancing, the things we can do to come together to work against the virus.
Yeah. It's such an incredibly serious issue, and I think optimizing the messaging component is super important to have a complete effective response to COVID-19. And one thing that I think is really interesting that's been very stark in COVID in the pandemic is while there's been a great deal of division in partisan media, a great deal of polarization and treatment of the issue in partisan media, and also amongst our elected representatives, or among some of our elected representatives more than others, in the mass public, it's actually been a pretty depolarized issue. Like if you look at opinion polling, the vast majority of people totally believe in COVID-19 is a real thing, are very concerned about it. Large majorities of people are very reluctant to reopen. So it's actually a kind of a stunning example, possibly because the issue is so new. It has had time to shake out into more polarization in the general public. But I can't really think of an example in recent history where there's such a mismatch between the consensus in the general public and the apparent polarization you might see from just turning on the news. And I think it's been particularly dangerous to have really a real small fringe kind of social movement that's opposed to any sort of public health measures that's been inflated in the coverage. So which I think is dangerous, because people could have the impression that it's like a 60-40 issue when it's like a 90-10 issue. So wanted to share with you some of the research we've been doing on this. Here, I'm going to again do a screen share here. So we got really interested in what could be done to further optimize public health messaging, acknowledging that we're already doing quite well, or I should say public health officials have done a very good job in America, and Americans have done a good job for the most part, And I think that when you look at the research on persuasion around issues like this, on public health issues, there's really two things you can try to intervene on. So one is optimizing the source of a persuasive message, and then two is optimizing the content. What my lab focuses on is content. Like we do things like the moral reframing research that I just showed you about how can you work on the subjective content of a message. But if you talk to people, or I have spoken with people who worked in Ebola response in Africa in the Obama administration, and they really say that source dominates content in this space. That if you're trying to get people to follow some basic public health guidelines, finding that most trusted source for their community is the best and most important first step. And I'm convinced that this is probably true. It's not what we specialize in, but I believe it's true. And what we haven't seen yet is research, or what I haven't seen yet is research looking at, would it be better to tailor to ideological subgroups? Would it be better to actually project bipartisan agreement? We haven't seen really examples of that, of like the ex-presidents coming together and saying, we all agree on this. But I am convinced that finding those most trusted sources for a given community is helpful. We've also been doing this work on trying to figure out what sort of a message would be most persuasive, along with lots of other labs. And we've specifically just wrapped up a couple studies where we targeted low compliance individuals, which is really, these are the people you want to persuade, right? You don't want to persuade the people that are already doing all the stuff that we're supposed to be doing. You want to find the people that are doing it at somewhat lower levels. That turns out to be its own trick, because those folks they're just hard to find, because luckily compliance is quite high. But the nature of this being what it is, you want to be hermetically sealed. We want to go from 80% to 90%, 90 to 95. Like, we want compliance. Compliance can't be too high on an issue like this. And what we did was we tested in total, I think, like 56 messages we gathered from a wide variety of sources. We tried to grab all the best messages that other labs were finding worked. We convened a conference we organized in like 5 days with labs from around the world, and found out what they had found that had worked, tested all these messages. And what we found worked the best was, interestingly, not messages that were tailored to people's ideologies and priors, but rather more sort of pro-social collectivist messages that just kind of appealed to people's kind of common moral goodness. So here's the highest scoring message we found in 2 tests so far. It'll probably sound familiar, but I think it's heartening that this was the most popular message in 2 studies. It read, "Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers are working around the clock, risking their lives to care for patients with the coronavirus, working long hours in highly infectious environments. Many of them are falling ill. As our healthcare workers put their lives on the line, we can do our part simply by staying home and limiting physical contact with others." It's not going to blow your mind, right? You've probably seen something like this on social media, but this consistently scores tops amongst conservatives, liberals, this sort of reciprocity-based message of like, you owe it to healthcare workers. The next highest scoring message is this one. A few weeks ago, Fiona was a healthy 26-year-old with no medical complications. Then she suddenly came down with a bad cough and a feeling like she could not breathe. She tested positive for COVID-19 and is now hospitalized, receiving oxygen from a ventilator and fighting for her life. This could be any of us. Please stay home and protect yourself against this virus. So what's distinctive about this is that this message is the exact opposite of an exponential growth model, right? It's like totally humanizes COVID-19. It makes it feel like something that you yourself could get, that sympathetic people get, that relatable people get. And so it's not, it moves through the statistics, moves past the statistics. What's interesting is that the least persuasive messages, I think, as I already alluded to, were the same stuff we find works best for polarized political issues. It's like obey the law, follow Trump's directives, appealing to religion, appealing to purity, appealing to patriotism. These messages we found haven't moved the needle at all. And I think, this is because in the mass public, it is not a particularly polarized issue. And I think, again, that's heartening. And I hope we can seize this moment where it isn't polarized, and maybe even reify that lack of polarization with an aggressive messaging strategy that brings people together and treats people not as divided, because they're not, not very divided, at least.
That's really interesting, just to see what messages works. I think people struggle so much with the concept of exponential growth, for example, but they can understand a young woman getting sick or an individual getting sick. it's also interesting to hear you talk about how we're not as polarized, because again, and this touches on my interest in and passion for journalism. Like it's how much do we cover the protesters with guns versus how much do we cover all the people who are staying home, and cooking together and modifying their lives. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump to Stephen again. And then we have a bunch of really interesting questions coming through in the chat. Stephen, you touched on something that I think about a lot in your first answer. You used the phrase a narrative not about dilution of ideas when you think about people coming together. And people ask me about this a lot, and I think about it, and I have to say I don't have a marvelous thoughts. I'm really curious yours, but this tension or perceived tension between being a partisan advocate for things you care about and being a uniter, in order to bridge, do we have to compromise our beliefs, our values, our agenda, and what we matter? So I'm curious what you think about that. Is that a dichotomy? Is it a false dichotomy? How do you navigate that? How do you think about it and talk about it as you go about your work?
Yeah, thank you, Eve. I think this is the essential question facing the political bridge building movement, in my opinion. I think it goes unresolved to our own detriment, and we have to be very thoughtful about this. The question is really, what type of bridges do we seek to build? And today in the national media, the notions of structural systemic change is offered up as in contrast to being quote unquote bipartisan and being moderate. And just when you hear those terms, think about all of the associations you have with that. When you hear structural systemic change, you might think of someone like an AOC who's very principled and about creating change on behalf of marginalized communities, and that they have more principles to them. They're fighting kind of the righteous cause. When you hear bipartisan, think about the associations with that. You're thinking of moderation, incrementalism, kind of an old way of doing business. And interestingly, the presidential election has really reinforced those existing archetypes that have existed certainly for the past 10 to 20 years. And in that you have bipartisan Joe Biden, who represented the kind of bipartisan moderate incrementalist, and then you had Bernie Sanders and obviously some other primary contenders like Elizabeth Warren, who represented the structural change candidates. And think about also the profiles of people you associate with each one. If you're thinking about structural systemic change, the AOC generation, you're thinking about young and diverse. When you think about bipartisan moderate, you're thinking about generally old white guy, to be frank. And so if we don't deal with these archetypes and narratives, I think we're going to be faced with a major problem in bridging divides. I think what we need to do to disrupt those narratives, in my view, I've been drawing a lot from Dr. King's teachings and his sermons, particularly from the late 1950s and the early 1960s. He was confronted with a lot of the same challenges. He had to, in many ways, build the case for bridge building in the civil rights movement. And it's really interesting, even fun for me, because I'm faced with a lot of the same questions when he's being interviewed and he's being attacked from people in his own tribe to say that his nonviolent approach to build bridges and to care about forgiveness and empathy was too soft and weak, wasn't up to the moment for the civil rights movement. Simultaneously, he was being critiqued from people who were moderates, who said that you are being too fast, you're asking for too much, you're being too radical. And look no further than his letter from a Birmingham jail to get his take on how he responded to that critique. So he's being called too weak and soft, too fast and radical. And he had to build the case for a radical vision for change, but also the need for bridge building. And I think part of it is being true to the principles of a vision for more civil rights. In our day, we might talk about the truth of climate change and how we need to solve a challenge like that. And then also you need to think about the methodology. In American diverse democracy that believes in pluralism, the best way to create change is building diverse coalitions of support. And you look even today, the people who tend to be the most partisan warriors, they tend to get the most Twitter followers, but they get often the least legislation passed. So I think what we need to do is draw on the lessons from Dr. King and kind of re-articulate it for today. I'm very focused on this, by the way. So anyone who's tuning in, if you care about this, want to work on it, please reach out to me. I'm very much trying to build kind of a team of support and hear different ideas that are out there. And I'll just give a very quick example to illustrate this today. The reason why Millennial Action Project has never really fit into any boxes well is because we don't fit into the boxes that the national media presents to us. But our young political leaders offering generational change have really lived out the Dr. King model of bridge building, even though there hasn't been a lexicon or a set of narratives around that. And one great example was gerrymandering reform in Ohio. Gerrymandering, as many people on this call know, is where you have many politicians and political parties who are choosing their voters instead of voters choosing their elected representatives. And it's been one of the drivers for polarization today. It's almost by definition a tribal issue because one side is benefiting and the other side is being disadvantaged. And so how do you break through that gridlock? In Ohio, shout out to anyone who's from Ohio on this call here, you had the Republicans in control and a Republican gerrymandered map. But our map leaders were saying this is wrong. We think people should win elections because they have the best ideas and the best candidates, not because they were cheating their voters. And I had our co-chair, a Republican in Ohio, came to us and said, I want to work on this issue. And I called people in Ohio and they all said, well, this is really cute, but nothing like this is ever going to pass. But we made that generational argument. We reframed it in exactly the ways that Robb is talking about. And didn't make it a tribal issue. It became more of a moral issue of what is right and wrong for the practice of democracy. What kind of political system do we want to leave to our children and grandchildren? It was a narrative that involved everyone. And one by one, we started building bipartisan support. Eventually, it passed the state legislature. And ultimately, it was approved by the voters in Ohio by 75% of the vote. So now partisan gerrymandering is over. So that's an example of something that we had a radical idea about structural systemic change. Like this will have tremendous benefits for every policy issue for the future of Ohio. And now, by the way, this is being spread to other states. But on top of that, we use the Kingsian methodology of building these bridges of not just people in the moderate center, but from across the political spectrum. And that's how we had enough support for it to ultimately pass. In my view, that's creating real change. And I think we need that model in many other areas.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate your answer. Just how you draw on the philosophical and moral and spiritual leadership of Dr. King in a really practical way. It's a nice through line. We have some questions that have showed up for you all. I wanted to invite Matt Byrne to unmute and ask your question, which I think builds on what you were just talking about. And Stephen, Matt, you framed it for Stephen, but I think actually it would be nice to hear from both of you on it. So are you there, Matt?
Yeah. Stephen, you were just speaking to this. So I asked the question earlier when you hadn't yet. So there. The question was, how do you balance the perceived tension between encouraging future-oriented thinking with welcoming conservatives who often frame issues as going back to traditional values? And so even just from like a messaging perspective and the perception from conservatives, how you think through those issues.
That's a great question and speaks to some of the framework that Robb was bringing up earlier as well. So I can give a real-time example that's, that we're very focused on where we've had to think about those value sets. And one maybe mental model that might be helpful is often liberals, conservatives, people from a variety of backgrounds who might not even fit into those labels can come to the same solution for often different reasons. The best example of this is criminal justice reform, where you had liberal support reducing mandatory minimum sentences and ending the war on drugs because they believed in more social justice, racial justice reasons. And the conservatives came at it from the angle of prisons are sometimes the most expensive, second most expensive item on a state's budget. And so it's about reducing the size of government. But here's a real-time example. Because of COVID-19, there's a real threat to our elections and whether or not we can hold safe and credible elections this November. It's a challenge that Millennial Action Project is very focused on. And you've probably heard calls to convert elections to vote by mail and how people can vote remotely. So we decided to get involved in this to build some of that bridge building in so there can be more of a unified message. And for our conservative leaders on the ground, one message we often heard was that we have a long time-honored tradition of absentee voting. And that if we can just build on this existing system of absentee voting, then we can create a very important option for people to vote remotely. Meanwhile, my friends on the left side of the spectrum are saying we need to convert our elections to vote by mail. Now, here's what I'm saying, and we often say in our Millennial Action Project meetings, we're advocating for the same thing. Expanding absentee voting is the same thing in many ways as converting to vote by mail. There's some differences around whether or not you proactively send ballots to voters, for example. There are certain things you can do to, for example, have secure drop boxes where you submit your absentee ballot. There's some differences that you can resolve, but by and large, there is wide agreement that we should strengthen the absentee voting system, make sure that election administrators have the resources. So the point is, we heard this goes back to the jazz metaphor of listening. This wasn't a top-down, hey, legislators, we're telling you what to think. We listened to them first and heard that they're framing this in let's get back to our traditional values of absentee voting. This is already on the books, and then working with them to further strengthen that. And that turned out to be a fruitful approach.
Rob, I know you do. Thank you, Stephen. I know you do a lot of work in this arena and with a lot of elections. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just specifically to Matt's, I think, excellent point of like, this might be a slightly different point than Matt's, but what do progressives who want to communicate effectively with conservatives who emphasize traditional values, how do they work with that? Because it seems for a progressive, like there's not a lot of overlap between the world progressives are trying to create and deep American traditions. And we find anyway in our messaging research that the idea of traditional values is very malleable and can actually be attached to progressive candidates and policies. And just one example, we found that in messaging around economically progressive 2020 presidential candidate, that talking about this candidate's policies, which were really very, very economically progressive, but talking about how they serve traditional American values like protecting, showing respect and protecting the dignity of workers, rewarding them for their hard work. That sort of a frame, which obviously tied to these values, is meant to be very progressive and inclusive. That pulled greater levels of support and agreement around this, for this candidate from conservatives. So that messaging kind of sounded like a Woody Guthrie song or something, of like use like patriot, like take the elements of American moral tradition that relate most clearly to your policies and make that case. It's another way to do it.
That's really fascinating. Jeanette Elstein, you had a question, and I think that both speakers have touched on it a little, but do you want to build on that?
Sure. And I asked this question a little earlier on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think my question was, it goes. I think I asked it when we were talking about moral foundations theory and different messaging based on that. But a lot of the examples have been about like particular issues or decisions or like a points in time And when you're kind of doing this bridging work, and even if people are coming up to the same conclusion for different reasons, or specific issues or decisions are framed, in someone's values, how does that carry over into future decisions that are related or adjacent, or maybe even not related? And so I don't know if there's an answer to that, but
yeah,
I was going.
Yeah, we haven't found those carryover effects. Like if you make a persuasive message on national health insurance, or say you're trying to convince liberals to be more supportive of the military, whatever it is, we haven't found those carryover effects to other issues. But I think applied to voting, that would be the place where you might see it. Because once somebody's like committed to vote for a candidate, that entails a whole agenda that they've at least signed up for at a moment in time. And then, they reflect on that going forward. And that's the kind of thing that could potentially change people in a more thoroughgoing way. But we haven't seen those effects, but we haven't looked for them as thoroughly as we'd like to. So this is helpful feedback.
Stephen, do you want to jump in, or?
I thought Rob answered it fine. I can offer a little bit more, or happy to move to the next question.
Sure. We have Paula. You had a question. Paula Wild. Do we have you?
Yes, you have me. Thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you.
So when you were speaking, Stephen, about the call and response piece, I personally run into, both within myself and within folks I'm having conversations with, that call and shutdown can happen pretty quickly, pretty regularly. And so I'm curious, in our current climate, and in your experience of working with a lot of people, what are some possibilities, opportunities, strategies to move from the call and shutdown state of things towards the call and response? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Paula. I think it's such an important one, because so many of us have been in those conversations, and you wonder, how do we evolve this conversation to a better place? And I'll draw from some experiences we had with Millennial Action Project doing a program called Red and Blue Dialogues across the state of Wisconsin. And the premise was we could bring our elected officials and their constituents together in a cross-partisan fashion. And our theory for doing it in Wisconsin was, there's some studies that show Wisconsin is the most polarized state in the country. So we thought, why don't we go to where the problem is potentially the most acute and see how people respond? And we were very intentional about the design of that, where participants, for example, would have to fill out a very quick pre-survey describing how they identify politically, which the responses were a ton of fun to read, and you realize how few people actually identify as Democrat or Republican. My personal favorite was a guy who he runs a brewery in Milwaukee. He identified as socialist libertarian. So I'll let everyone unpack what that means. But everyone came with their own kind of identities, and we curated the tables to be politically diverse, but no one sitting there knew where people were coming from. They were just representing themselves, no larger institution. And I recall a dialogue we had on criminal justice reform, and we were doing the readouts afterwards. And a woman comes up to me and she says, "Hey, Stephen, I love the conversation, but I just felt like we were agreeing way too much." And I said, "Well, ma'am," and I knew that she was a liberal activist from how we curated the tables. And I said, "Well, just to your left was the local head of the Republican Party, and to your right was the local head of a right-wing group called Americans for Prosperity." And of course, she's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I was sitting next to the enemy," right? And so the point is, if it's not starting from an adversarial place, it's so easy in our two-party duopoly to be in an us versus them frame. But if you can design a conversation where you were coming from our own unique places, jazz is all about this, where there's so many different and unique identities. It's the opposite of a duopoly, where you can come together, and then it's more about, okay, where does your idea intersect with mine? And then you might be surprised afterwards, if you're a Democrat or Republican, which party some of the others affiliate with.
Thank you, Stephen. I asked Rob a little earlier about COVID research and what he's seeing. I'm curious what you've seen in the last few months that either is heartening or surprising or perplexing. Sort of what you're seeing as legislators work to kind of respond to this moment. Are you seeing what does it feel like?
Is this for me or for Stephen?
I meant it for Stephen, actually.
Oh, good. Okay.
But I'm sure I can. But I asked it for both. I'm just really curious if you talked, Rob, about us being less polarized, in fact, and around COVID response than other things. And I'm curious if that is what you're seeing, Stephen. And yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And David Brooks has a great piece in the New York Times today about how America looks a lot better from the bottom up. And I think he's right, because when you look at the community level, there's a lot of agreement. Wisconsin was in the news recently because our Supreme Court struck down the stay-at-home order, and gosh, it's so polarized. But when I was actually talking to people on the ground, I hear Republicans saying, yeah, my left of center friends are like most militant about staying right of center friends are most militant about staying at home, and their left of center friends are saying, when can we kind of open up? So I think the narratives on the ground are not always how they are presented nationally, but I think there's a lot of consensus on generally needing to stay safe right now, and the polling data shows that as well. The response in the state legislatures is interesting because I think generally there is a sense that we need to make sure that businesses are able to not all go under. And you even saw in Congress that all of the COVID relief bills were all passed on a wide bipartisan basis. Now, I would argue that they could have been passed a little bit faster if they had better bridge building and better relationships across the aisle. But regardless, they still passed it with wide support. And similarly, you're seeing that at the state level, where a lot of COVID relief bills are being passed on a wide bipartisan basis. I think the biggest question between now and sort of the end of the year on response is whether the narrative around COVID involves everyone, and the decision makers, the messages they're putting out. Are they trying to score short-term political points, or are they trying to solve the public health and economic and electoral disasters that are in front of us? And I think we obviously need to move our leaders more to the latter standpoint.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I wanted to take one last question. We're running up against time. It's from Veronica, but I don't have a last name. Are you with us?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could both speak a little bit about how we could start conversations with children from a young age across red-blue divides, given that they absorb a lot of what they hear in their household, their communities, etc.
And I hate to do this, Rob and Stephen, but we're up against time, so you both have to be short.
Rob, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, Veronica, I don't remember if this was you in the chat or somebody else, but I mean, being very careful what you say, not encouraging a sort of flattening of a group as having no depth. If a kid's growing up in a liberal household, just being careful not to speak in ad hominem terms about, rival political groups and vice versa. If it's a conservative home, I think it's really important, if we're going to have a next generation that does better than the last one and better, if we're going to find improvement, the way we talk to our kids about engaging people with depth and humanity is going to be really important. It's going to be a big part of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Veronica, I think this is the perfect question to close on, because I get so fired up when I'm at schools and I'm talking with young people. The good thing about children and the younger generation is they've already got it right for the most part. These partisan tribal behaviors are learned over time. They're fed to you by all of these structures that are in our media and our politics. And I always say, we're not born to discriminate against other people. We're not born to hate other people. Those are all learned behaviors. So I think that the real challenge is with kids, how do you get them to keep the open-mindedness and I think, orientation towards collaboration that they already have, and keep that youth alive? And certainly as they get to maybe middle school, high school, and then certainly college, then I think intentionally setting up more red and blue dialogues. And, we had a program called that, but you can organize those in your own ways in your communities to further exercise those bridge building muscles. And I often use the exercise metaphor because it's one that you need to do over time to make more routine for you. And it's like a muscle. When you build that muscle, then you're going to be much stronger at bridge building. And so I love kids because they already got it, and we need to just keep them young as long as possible.
Thank you, Stephen. I wholeheartedly really agree with you. I think with children, sometimes it's so much about what you don't say, all the horrible, what you protect them from and buffer them from. So thank you both. I'm so grateful for the work you do in communities and labs. And I feel really lucky to have shared this time with you. I really want to thank the team behind the scenes who has put together this remarkable thing where we can all connect. I'm in my basement. And I wanted now to go ahead and introduce the Reverend Jen Bailey. I think you will all really take heart and be heartened by what she has to say. She's a minister, a public theologian. She's a leader in multi-faith movements for justice. She founded the Faith Matters Network, and also is a co-founder of the People's Supper, which launched in, I think, January 2017, and they bring people together for meals to talk about important issues to communities. And I actually was lucky enough to attend one of those suppers. It was beautifully done, and I learned a lot and grew from it. But today, the Reverend Bailey will offer some important principles to think about as you come out of this day of engaging with these issues, and as you think about assimilating them and integrating them into your work and lives. So I can't see you, Reverend Bailey, but I think you're there, and so please jump in. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for hanging in there. It is the end of the day, and if you're like me and have had many meetings on Zoom this week, just greatly appreciate your flexibility and staying in there with us throughout the day. So I thought I'd start by sharing a story. I'm a preacher in the Black church tradition, and we are a people of story in my tradition. And as I was reflecting on this keynote and our time together, my memory took me back to November 1st, 2018. That evening, I found myself in a church gymnasium in Charlotte, North Carolina, leading a people's supper that bridged across red and blue divides. About half the participants in that room identified as Republican, the other half as Democrat, and we were about 6 days ahead of the 2018 midterm elections. And I remember sitting down at my table with folks I'd just met that evening, and a sense of palatable anxiety being present at the table. See, folks knew that they were going to be sitting down next to folks who believed differently than they did. They didn't know who those folks were necessarily. And I remember a young woman by the name of Sarah who sat down next to me. Sarah was an African-American young woman who'd grown up in the suburbs of Charlotte, herself identifying as somebody to the right of the political spectrum. And she turned to me and said, "Reverend Jen, I'm not sure that I know how to do this bridging divides work. I feel like I've come up in a time where all we know is stories of division." And I turned back to her and I said, "Well, we can experiment and try to create a brave space together." And she took a deep breath and said, "All right, if you're going to try, I'm going to try too." And as I think about my own experiences over the past several years, as co-founder of the People's Supper, a project that has hosted over 1,800 suppers nationally and internationally, attempting to experiment and do this bridging divides work, I think about people like Sarah. I think about the folks that I've had the opportunity to sit down with at picnic tables in the mountains of East Tennessee and in elementary school gymnasiums in places like Camden, New Jersey, in dormitories in the middle of the Midwest in colleges and university dorm rooms. And one thing that has been at the center of our work with the People's Supper that I've carried with me over these past couple of years has been this notion, a mantra even, that has adopted from the work of Stephen Covey, that says that relationships move at the speed of trust, but our intervention at the People's Supper is that social change moves at the speed of relationships. And so before we can begin the work of bridging differences or bridging divides, asking the core question of what needs healing here is so central to how we think about this work as we carry it out in the world. In a lot of ways, I gotta tell y'all, I feel like I was built for this work. I feel like it is totally my jam, and it should be. See, I grew up between two radically different places. A small town called Quincy, Illinois, on the banks of the Mississippi River, which borders Iowa and Missouri. And then I grew up on the south side of Chicago, having experiences in rural communities and in one of the largest cities in our country. I am an African-American preacher who is married to a practicing Jew who regularly in my household lives this reality of what it means to bridge both racial and religious difference. And I have to, if I'm going to be transparent, I think over the past several years, I've become a part of a new sort of resurgence of bridging differences work, an ecosystem of folks, particularly after the 2016 moment, who began to create new projects and initiatives and ideas aimed at this question of bridging differences. I became what some might call a professional bridge builder. And for myself, I never necessarily thought that that would be part of my vocational identity. But if I'm going to be honest with you all, and if a preacher can't be honest, I don't know who can. Lately, I've found myself questioning a lot of what I thought I knew about bridging differences work. And in particular, what it means when we talk about an expert in this field. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, in the buckle of the Bible Belt, a blue spot in a really red state. And since March, we've encountered two major disasters, weather disasters, first a tornado, and then another major weather event last week. As the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic has captured our national and global attention, it's been personal for me. I run a team that is largely folks who are folks of color. I've had team members who've lost people to COVID-19 in this season. And if there's anything that can humble you and help you to reevaluate what you think you know when it comes to expertise, it's these moments that disrupt our perceived notions of who we are and what we think we do in the world. And one of the beautiful things that has emerged from this moment, which has been filled with a lot of loss and grief, has been my being reminded of the folks who were my first teachers around these questions of bridging divides and bridging differences. Some of those experts are folks that you've gotten to hear from today, but some of those folks are the church mothers that I grew up with in Quincy, Illinois. The women who manned the church kitchen and made plates for folks who were hungry, regardless of who they were or where they came from, so that all had space to eat. It was the teachers who taught in my elementary school, folks from all sorts of backgrounds and differences. It was the janitorial staff at the local hospital in the town where I grew up, who, when my mom was sick with cancer and on her deathbed, the woman who cleaned the rooms, Miss Margaret, would come by every day just to check in and see how my mom was doing. Now, Miss Margaret was of a different racial background than my mom, was of a different, in this case, religious background as well. But those were the people in my life who modeled for me so beautifully what it meant to bridge difference. And so as we embark upon this collective work together, as we think about what it means to realize and actualize this work and manifest it into the world in a season of deep uncertainty where we don't know which way to turn, we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, I invite you to look for the bridge builders in your community, the people who are going about the toil and the work, the unsung heroes who don't get fancy closing keynotes at the Bridging Difference conference, but the people who, like Miss Margaret, see Bridging Difference as a core part of their vocational identity, not because they've gotten the training, but because it's part of who they are. Folks like so many of you who are on the call and who've been a part of this conversation throughout the day. And I'll be honest, it's not easy. We've heard all day what some of the challenges are to us being able to bridge differences and divides in this moment. And as I am preparing in my own life to welcome my first child into the world, I gotta have hope and a sense of optimism, or else I don't know what I'm bringing a baby into. And I believe that part of that work of bridging differences and bridging divides is about looking around the room that you're in today, looking at all of the Brady Bunch squares on the screen right now, and remembering that you're not alone in this work and in this movement. I'll leave you today with an anchoring document that has been important to each of our People's Supper suppers. It's the one thing that, whether we've been in Brooklyn, New York, or Creed, Colorado, has united each of our People's Supper. And it's a poem written by my dear beloved sister and colleague, Mickey Scott Bay Jones, called An Invitation to Brave Space. And it simply says this: together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. The spaces that you will create after you leave this room won't be perfect. It won't always be what you wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. And so, as we depart from this place and begin to break into small groups in just a moment, I invite you all to figure out and think about, what does brave space mean to you? What would it take to step outside the bounds of your comfort zone, whether that be in your work life or your personal life, and engage in the work of being vulnerable, of realizing that each of us starts somewhere and continues to grow, but also has the responsibility to examine what we think we know. It's hard for me, y'all. I like to pretend like I know everything. But one of the things that I've realized in this work of bridging differences is that bridging work, like so much other work in the world, is a cyclical and not a linear process. It's something that we return to time and time again. It is a practice that we return to time and time again, knowing that the work is never done. But if we come together and attempt to do this work together, perhaps we can move that wheel a little bit further down the road. Perhaps in a generation from now, as I think about the baby in my belly right now, the world will look a little bit different for them than it does right now. And so with that, I am so grateful to each and every one of you for engaging in this work, for being brave enough to do this work at a time where it seems almost countercultural and, dare I say, revolutionary to talk about bridging differences in this season. And very quickly, when we think about the word revolutionary or radical, the word radical in particular, the root of that word is rooted, right? So radical work like bridging differences, is work that is rooted. It is rooted in place. It is rooted in people. It is rooted in those bridge builders that exist throughout our communities, the unsung saints and heroes who help move our societies forward and care for us deeply. So with that, as we transition from this brave space to the brave spaces that you will encounter in the world outside of this virtual community, I invite you to consider this question. What is one idea that you'll take away from today? And how will you try to apply it in your work or personal life? In just a moment, you'll get an invitation to break into small group breakout sessions. And so again, just to repeat this question again, what is just one idea? Not 5, not 10, because we got a limited amount of time, y'all, but just one idea that you'll take away from today, and how will you try to apply it actively, whether it's in your work or in your personal life? And in just a moment, you should get an invitation to join small groups. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
All right, we are mostly back. I think some of us are still making our way back from breakouts. One thing I wanted us to clarify is we're reconvening here. Originally, the plan was to do this activity in the chat, and we were fortunately because we have fewer folks with us now. At the end of the day, we were able to have small enough breakouts where people would actually have time to share. So we're appreciative of that. Appreciative for the folks perhaps in later time zones who dropped off earlier, and so there's a little bit more space for people sharing the breakouts. I wanted just to leave a few minutes here at the end for folks, if anyone wanted to just share some of what they shared in the breakout, just to click the raise hand button or to hit in your reactions your thumbs up, and we can unmute you just for a couple of folks if you wanted to share back out with the full group. Wanda, would you like to share?
Thank you. Yes, I was really inspired in our group as far as just the emotion and just feeling kindred spirits. I mean, there was so much today that was really great to hear, and just to have some things confirmed, but also to feel challenged to continue the work, and that there's so many people across not just the country, but this world who you all drew to this workshop. And I really appreciate your organization, the way that you made it comfortable for us to interact, and gave us opportunity to speak with each other, but to hear from great leaders in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for a couple minutes if anyone else would like to share. I mean, just any closing intentions and things that you're taking away from the day. And also, I think we still have Jen Bailey with us.
I'm
well?
still here. Yeah,
okay,
no, I'm here.
Okay. Didn't see you there.
Looks like we have a raised hand from Dick Coleman. Dick, would you like to share?
Sure. The thought that was just coming to mind, which I know we touched on earlier in the day, I'm still guessing that the majority of people who are involved in this conference are from the liberal or progressive side of at least the political divide. And even though that was touched on, maybe I'm wrong, but I just think of how important it is to be finding the ways to reach across that divide. I mean, that was talked a little bit earlier. I so appreciated, I think his name is Jacob Hess from Utah, coming and being part of it from a different perspective than maybe many of us, but it just feels like that is a big challenge for all of us. So just wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. And I think I see one more hand up. Chelsea Kina. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
That's me. Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody. I work, I'm a manager of a customer happiness team and spend so much time being a moderator and leader when it comes to difficult conversations. And this is the first space I've been in a long time where I was like, yay, these people are so much better at this than me. And like just felt really humbled by the tools that I was given, where I could walk away with things I can use instead of trying to kind of muster it up in myself. And it puts me on this learning path for the future, of knowing there are resources out there. And I have to say, I felt that way when I first found the Greater Good Science Center about a year ago, in the middle of kind of a compassion fatigue burnout in my life and on my team. So thank you for all the good work each of you is doing. And as someone who is not particularly religious, I love walking away with that phrase from earlier of the God in me sees the God in you. That was a really special moment. So thank you all.
Thank you, Chelsea. Great. I can't see Jen. Do you see any other?
I don't see any more raised hands, but do see some really beautiful comments in the chat box. So thank you all so much for your willingness to share your continued questions. I think one of my favorite professors in seminary used to say is, I have more questions than answers, more problems than solutions of these things I freely give. And so similarly, I know that we're all leaving with a lot more questions, maybe even than we carried in, but that's a sign of a good conference. And I know Greater Good is so excited to continue to be a resource for you. So with that, I'll pass it back to Jason.
Thank you. And I just want to say it is one of the great joys of my work to get connected to some really special and inspiring and energizing folks. And at the top of my list is Reverend Jen Bailey for all time, for my 20 years of working at the Greater Good Science Center, in terms of the people who I feel like I am most fortunate to have gotten connected to. So thank you, Jen, for being part of this work, for being part of the day, and sharing the space with us virtually, and for all of your flexibility in making it work in this new format. And I wanted to just guide us in. We have 3 minutes left. A few things in flipping our previous activity from reflection into the small groups. We want to just to invite you for this final activity that we're going to do in small groups to do in the chat for just, I think we have this final slide up here. If you have it there, there we go. Instead of going into breakouts, we want to invite everyone just to share. You've all been sharing some really beautiful reflections and words here in closing. We want to just to share, each of you, there are still well over 200 folks on in the event, just to share one word that you're taking away from the day that kind of encapsulates your experience overall of our day together. Thank you. Great. So as those keep rolling in, thank you for sharing. I wanted to share just a few final words and respond to a few questions that have come up throughout the day. Actually, on the next slide, I think. Tom, please, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks. So ways to follow up and ways to sustain some of the conversations and ideas that have started here today. We are just now producing a new resource we're calling the Bridging Differences Playbook. A lot of the skills and ideas that have come up today, we've tried to encapsulate in this guide, and it's available as a free download from our site. And it has not only a breakdown of some of the skills, but also an index of leading organizations, including some of those you've heard about today: People Supper, Millennial Action Project, Interfaith Youth Corps, listings of those and dozens of other organizations like them with information and how to find out more, as well as breakdowns, step-by-step instructions for how to do. We've identified from our review of the research and best practices out in the field, about 14 core skills for bridging, just as a way of taking the work a little bit further. And we've really been inspired. And that project, I should say, in many ways was the brainchild of Scott Shigioka. He's not only a terrific dancer, but also just a tremendously creative and energizing presence and partner, and has really kind of willed the playbook into life and really benefited from a lot of feedback from people along the way. So we'd encourage you, please, to check it out, download it. The link should be up on the slide, but we'll be sending out a link to it as well in a closing email, and would love your feedback. There's our email address in there for you to share any kind of feedback just to help us improve our work as we move forward. And so in closing, and along with that, we'll share the playbook, share the videos from the day, slides from the day, and also this idea came up, and we would love to follow up on it, ways of fostering more conversation with folks who participated today. I know it was a big group, hard to have a lot of deep and sustained conversations, and we're looking into ways we could perhaps have smaller follow-up conversations with folks who joined us today, using what was shared today as a springboard, using perhaps even contents from the playbook for those who try it as a springboard to deeper ongoing conversation as well, so we can continue to share and learn from each other. And I know that there's a lot more that we could share and learn together, but I feel like it's already been a very packed and rich day. So I wondered if we could just, in closing, I know everyone's been muted, but I wonder, team, if we could unmute everyone just for a closing gratitude.
Tell you about a TV show.
Speakers, thank our production team, thank our Greater Good Science Center, all my colleagues.
Ask people to unmute.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Finish. Thank all of you so much for your time and attention, being part of
the hard work.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's great.
Same.
Cacophony is a lot of bad sounding noises. Well, like, no, you can't have a good cacophony. A cacophony is like, you know, when you walk into the classroom and all the kids are screaming at once.
Thank you for being part of the day.
Indoor rainy days.
Well, all right, thank you, and we will follow up and be in touch, and would love to get your feedback on the day. So thanks so much for being with us, and thanks again to all of our speakers and our team and all of our moderators for really making this such a seamless and rich and inspiring day.